Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, and it seemed like an open and shut case. Many people crowded in the small room at Los Angeles' Ambassador Hotel that fateful night and saw the assassin, Sirhan Sirhan, pull the trigger. He was also convicted of the crime and is still in prison with a life sentence. But conspiracy theorists have jumped on inconsistencies in the eyewitness testimonies and anomalies in the forensic evidence to suggest that he was only one shooter in a larger conspiracy. They also say that his claim that he has no recollection of the event shows that he was hypnotized and could be some sort of Manchurian Candidate. Today I'm speaking with Mel Ayton, author of the book The Forgotten Terrorist. He argues that there's a wealth of evidence about Sirhan and his hatred for RFK that motivates the killing. He describes eyewitness accounts and overlooked forensic evidence, and even Sirhan's personal notes, and shows that Sirhan was in fact the lone assassin whose politically motivated attack can be explained in light of larger international events. Mel was also a guest last year when he talked about presidential assassination attempts that were carried out in the 20th century against FDR, Lyndon B. Johnson, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and many others. So there's a lot to unpack in here about what goes through the mind of someone who wants to take out a high-profile individual. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Mel Ayton. Mel, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Scott. It's nice talking to you again.
Well, the last time you were here, we talked all about presidential assassinations, and we've featured this topic a lot on the podcast. And you mentioned the background of people who would target a president. What are the reasons that somebody would do this, and what's the profile? And I think something that you pinpointed is that a lot of these people are failed upstarts in life, and many of them have mental illnesses, and they don't seem to care who it is they're going after as president as long as they happen to be the chief executive. We're going to focus on one person in particular, and this has to do with the second edition of your book, The Forgotten Terrorist, on Sirhan Sirhan. I want to start off with this question. Why do you call Sirhan Sirhan the Forgotten Terrorist? Because it seems like this assassin is perhaps the most well-known until you get up into the actual presidential assassins, the Lee Harvey Oswalds and John Wilkes Booth. So why is Sirhan Sirhan the Forgotten Terrorist, at least according to your book?
Goes back to the time that the assassination happened in June of 1968. Palestinian terrorists just were getting off the ground in terms of organization, Al-Fatah. They started their first incursions across the border from Jordan into Israel around about 64. They soon took off in about 66. They became more militant. But the United States the American public really didn't know much about the Palestinians, which is why when the Robert Kennedy assassination occurred, they were referring to a Jordanian immigrant, in other words, Sirhan. And the American media didn't recognize the connection between Sirhan and the Palestinians and the conflict in the Middle East vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It wasn't until much later when you had, the affair in Munich and the terrible events there in 1972, and as the 70s progressed, and Yasser Arafat became an international cultural hero to the left with his appearance at the UN wearing a pistol, the people started to recognize, goodness me, we have this terrible problem. It's called Middle East terrorism. All of the evidence was there from the beginning that Sirhan considered himself to be a Palestinian. And he was really excited about what Al-Fatah was doing. He went to a college in Pasadena for a year and 3 months, I believe it was. It wasn't a long time, but at that period in time, you did have quite a large Arab student population. And he did associate with quite a lot of Palestinians at that time, and Arabs from other parts of the Middle East, Lebanon, Jordan. So we have a Sirhan at that time who knew what he was talking about. I mean, he wasn't fantasizing about, uh, the Palestinians who were really were becoming more and more violent against the Israelis. So it was Sirhan who knew what he was saying, but it was the American public who didn't, if you get my meaning.
Okay, so that's where you see him as forgotten because there wasn't a simple place to place him in the scope of national and international politics in 1968 to observers at the time. Is that correct?
That's true, Scott. They placed him as a Jordanian immigrant who was obviously an Arab, but they didn't use the term Palestinian until much, much later. Now, he committed this act, which was a terrorist act. He knew it was a terrorist act. He did it for political reasons. He did it for personal reasons as well, which we might get into. Because nothing, you don't have simple motives with assassins. You often have multiple motives. So there was the personal motive with Sirhan, and there was the political.
Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about the assassination, and then after that, a lot of what you do is try to correct what you see as an incorrect interpretation of the assassination. Let's look at the event itself first. From what you can tell, what was Sirhan's motivation for the assassination, and what was happening in 1968 that led up to it?
The Six-Day War occurred a year practically to the day, June 6, 1967, and a year to the day, Sirhan found out there was going to be a demonstration by American Jews in Los Angeles. That incited him. The press was full of the one-year anniversary of the Six-Day War. That also excited him too. He was really at that period of time getting more and more angrier. His brothers testified to this. His friends, like John and Patricia Strathman, his boss, John Widener, all testified to this fact that he was really touchy. He felt he had an inferiority complex in American society. He thought people were out to get him because he was an Arab and a Palestinian. He thought that he was a failure in life. He failed at college. He went to Pasadena College. He wasn't unintelligent, I mean, he wasn't. There were a lot of things going on. For one reason or another, he failed. His sister had died of leukemia. He was quite upset about that. But he was also, wanted to be a jockey. And he set his sights on that. He chose being a jockey because his brother, Sharif, played the horses, as it were. And he picked up that interest from his brother. He was short, 5'3". He wanted to. He thought he'd make a jockey, but the sad fact of the matter is that he started off as an exercise boy with a couple of race courses and ranches, and he just didn't have it. I mean, the people around him, like other workers at the ranches, said he was terrible with horses. He was very cruel to them as well, which an awful lot of people who write about conspiracies just don't understand his background. One trainer saw him punch a horse and then start kicking it, in that he had an uncontrollable temper. But you'll never find that in the conspiracy books. They all see him as a polite, well-mannered young man. They do this by choosing perhaps 5 or 6 acquaintances or friends, whereas I've got a litany of people who knew him very well, including his boss, John Widener, who was with him an awful lot, and testimony from his brothers as well, showing that he wasn't the mild-mannered personality that the conspiracy writers make him out to be. So anyway, he tried to be. He failed at being a jockey. He fell off his horse. He had an accident. He had an eye injury and a head injury. So you really, and then he went to work for John Widener, who had a health food store in Pasadena. He fell out with his boss, John Widener. John Widener said he was very touchy, taciturn, just like his student friends, his other friends described him. A chip on his shoulder. He didn't like to be criticized. And that all went along with his belief in being an Arab. Nasser was his hero, and he was touchy. And he was very critical of American foreign policy. He was really raged against the Jews in America, thought that the Jews controlled everything, and that when people heard his name, Sirhan Sirhan, he got very touchy about that because he thought they were sneering at him. So you have this, wealth of evidence to show that not only was he disturbed as a person, but he was really disturbed with his politics. He kept a diary. He wrote in his diary he wanted to kill, famous Jews like Ambassador Goldberg. He wanted to kill Lyndon Johnson at one time, he wrote in his book. He was this nobody. He wanted to be a somebody. And, he gained being a somebody, of course, as many assassins have, by committing a really horrible act.
It sounds like the profile of a lot of other assassins and would-be assassins you mentioned in Hunting the President, where he almost doesn't seem to care about the person, but wants to go after the office. He wanted to target LBJ, but if, let's say, Nixon were president at the time, he would have gone after Nixon. Do you see that in terms of who he's trying to target?
Yes, he wanted to target someone famous. And remember at that time, America in the 1960s, there was conspiracy hysteria with the JFK assassination. JFK assassination stories were in the newspapers on practically a daily level. And so he wanted to become the second Kennedy assassin. I mean, killing Robert Kennedy would have obviously and did make him more famous than perhaps killing any other politician. That's why he didn't target McCarthy, for example. He didn't target Nixon. Killing Robert Kennedy would, fit in with the conspiromania, as it were, in the 1960s with the JFK assassination. He read extensively on the JFK assassination, but he read extensively on other assassinations. And in one of his textbooks, he actually underlined and marked passages which talked about, how these events made other assassins famous.
Let's look into the RFK assassination itself. Again, in your other writings, you've talked at length about how many would-be assassins are foiled because they often have mental illness. They are writing to the FBI or the Secret Service their intentions, and when you broadcast your intentions, you're not going to succeed for the most part. What did Sirhan Sirhan do, and why was he successful at his assassination when many others who are of his stock typically don't succeed?
You're right that a lot of them, kept diaries, memoirs of, their activities, their feeling that they wanted to kill a certain president. Many of these never panned out, of course. Most of them, Lee Harvey Oswald, for example, kept a diary when he was in Russia, but he didn't keep a diary up until the point he killed JFK. So what they are doing is that they have these fantasies and they are expressing them on paper. Arthur Bremer, another one who shot George Wallace in 1972, Arthur Bremer kept a diary. Why Sirhan was different is that Sirhan didn't go around telling people about his diary. He was doing this for his own reasons because he joined the Rosicrucians. Now, the Rosicrucians wrote self-help books. And one of the self-help books they wrote was how to hypnotize yourself to make you more successful. And so Sirhan was following, the advice of the Rosicrucians. He also had prior knowledge of hypnotism too, after reading Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. The protagonist there is Perry Smith. And he identified with Perry Smith, according to Robert Blair Kaiser, who wrote about Sirhan, who interviewed Sirhan. He felt great empathy with Perry Smith. Perry Smith was like him. He was an underdog in society. He was short of stature.